Earlier in the year, I gave a talk at the iSpring Days conference all about getting the most out of your SME relationships. It was a fantastic conversation and I was really pleased to be invited to speak. So I thought now it's the end of the year, I'd go back, recap and update that presentation and share it with all of you. Throughout there are prompts and opportunities to get involved in the conversation. Obviously that doesn't quite work in this format, so please do make use of the comments to share your reflections and thoughts on the way through, or if you have any top tips for getting the most out of SME relationships. But without further ado, let's jump in. Hi and welcome to this session about getting the most out of your SME relationships. Subject matter experts, or SMEs, are probably some of the most important people we build relationships with as instructional designers. We rely on them to create accurate and impactful content, but they're also a strong partnership to help us gain buy-in within the organisation. In this presentation, we'll take a look at how we can improve those relationships. And to start things off in that exact vein, I'd like you to take a moment to reflect. I'd like you to think about your experience working with subject matter experts across all of your career or just your most recent role. I'd like you to think about how those relationships have evolved over time and how they are right now. I'd like you to think about what you get out of them and what they get out of them and how successful they've been. But most importantly, take a moment and boil down 3 words that best describe your SME relationships right now. If you'd like to share those with us in the comments, please do. If you'd like to keep them private, that's absolutely fine as well. If you get to the end of this presentation and you think, I'd like to share and I'd like to also talk about what I've learned, please drop that in the comments as well. While you're there, you can always hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Take a moment, pause the video if you need to, and come up with those 3 words that best describe your SME relationships. So, I'd like to, before we really get into content, kick things off with a little bit of a caveat, a qualification if you will, for everything I'm going to say. Every organisation is different, and therefore whenever we make generalisations about SMEs as if they're all one group of people, or how we can make better relationships with people as if all relationships follow the same basic rules, well, as the slide says, here be dragons. Inherently, half of what I say will not apply to you, another third of it maybe you'll just be wrong in your context, and then there will be some nuggets of truth. Everything that I say, as everyone does in these presentations, is some form of generalisation. However, I like to think that none of the generalisations here limit the application of what we're talking about. Instead, where I use generalisations, first of all, they'll be called out, and second of all, we try and focus on things that are universally useful. Just as all people are different, there is also a big difference between whether you're working in a project setting or a BAU or business as usual setting. Inherently, SMEs working in projects versus in their day-to-day roles are very different people. You will have very different working relationships with them. You'll have very different needs that you'll be putting upon them as well. It's important that you understand the setting that you work in before you try and apply anything we discuss in this presentation. You'll also find with SMEs there are internal and external relationships as well as different types of SMEs. These 2 sections we will actually look at within this presentation, but it's important to remember that these 3 areas, project versus business as usual, internal and external, and type of SME, will really help shape what you can apply and when you should apply it. So, let's dive in to the first generalisation we're going to look at, what I call the 3 types of SME. Now, Obviously, SMEs are human beings, and therefore every single one of them is individual. However, we need to form certain groups so that we understand what kind of relationship we're looking to generate with each SME that we work with. I like to think of SMEs as falling into one of three categories. This way I can make sure that I know who I'm dealing with and what value they can add. The first group are technical SMEs. These are your SMEs that provide content knowledge and make sure every detail of what you create is correct. These are what you might call classic SMEs. They know their stuff, they know it inside and out, they are true experts in their field. Next up, we have functional SMEs. Now, these people can provide audience and implementation knowledge related to modality and design. These are your team leaders and managers, those that have rolled out content to this audience before, perhaps even advocates within the audience themselves that can really help you make sure that whatever you create is created and deployed in a way that will give you the maximum chance of success. These SMEs will have very little input on your content, but much more value to offer around the actual content creation process. Finally, we have Sentinel SMEs. These may be senior stakeholders and board members with very minimal technical or functional implementation knowledge who are involved simply because they are the project sponsor. Now, it's easy to consider these people as getting in the way, slowing things down, or having very little to bring to the table. But the simple fact is, chances are that you wouldn't be doing this project if they weren't backing you. So, by identifying who your Sentinel SMEs are, you know where your political support comes from. When you need to go to the board for budget or time or additional support, it's your Sentinel SMEs who will be there to support you. They are your political clout, your leverage, your way to gain buy-in among other senior leaders and board members. Whilst we have these three key types of SMEs, there's another really important consideration. What motivates someone as an SME? SME is not usually someone's job title. Almost always, your SMEs are supporting you as well as completing their own duties. So it's important to understand what's motivating an individual to be an SME. This is where one of those considerations I mentioned at the start comes in: internal versus external. Your internal SMEs might be drawn from within the organisation and or the actual function that you're currently supporting. These might be great performing individuals who can offer their insight when creating new high performance individuals. These might be people who wrote policy documents for the business and therefore are the obvious choice when those policies go into the training phase. External SMEs tend to be wider industry experts and may even be full-time professional SMEs. It's very common to bring in a professional external SME around very important legal and compliance topics like GDPR and health and safety. The difference between these two is fairly immediately obvious. An external SME is going to be probably paid for their time. It's also, and more importantly, a deliberate choice to be an SME. It is their chosen career. Internal SMEs often are not full-time SMEs and will not receive any financial remuneration. This leads into the second pair of considerations here: paid versus volunteer. If you're paid, your motivation is fairly obvious. You're able to offer dedicated time by working as an SME as a full-time job, or perhaps a part-time job, but regardless of the hours given, you are being paid for it. You have no conflicting pull on your time. Volunteer SMEs, on the other hand, want to help, but are also required to maintain their day-to-day duties. This is a very, very common relationship with SMEs that we will have as learning and development professionals. When those high-performing individuals are supporting us, they're often expected to do so alongside their current role, often with very little or no consideration made regarding their own targets and KPIs. Because of that, it's really important that we acknowledge the value that they're bringing and ensure that they aren't being taken advantage of. On that note, let's talk about making friends. To put it bluntly, no one likes the person who only shows up when you need help moving house. So, as L&D professionals, let's never be that person. I like to think of 3 key things that you do to make sure that you're not only showing up to ask for SME support as and when you need it. Instead, we need to focus on building a relationship from day one. When you go into a new organisation or start a new project, identify who's going to be involved very early on. Figure out who you might potentially need help from now or in the future. This is especially true when entering a whole new business. I always say when I start in a new business, I immediately make a beeline for the people in IT, for the people in data security, and for whoever is in charge of the learning platform. Be that some element of HR, some element of IT, or another area of learning and development. These are people that I am definitely going to be calling on for support at some point. So rather than waiting until my metaphorical moving day and then asking them to lug around heavy boxes, I go to them on day one of my career, my time in this organisation, and start building the relationship. This leads directly into point 2 here around generating social capital. It can sometimes sound a bit dry and corporate to talk about human relationships in terms of capital, but let's be realistic. In the workplace, we're not all friends. Our relationships are not always ones that we would choose. In fact, we often work with people that, other than work, we probably would never have a relationship with. Therefore, our relationships are, to a certain extent, transactional. And it's easy to say that transactional relationships are bad or lesser in some way, but they are simply a reality of the workplace. Because of that, it's important that you always know that you are in debit with your social capital. You build social capital by doing things for other people, by going out of your way to support them rather than just asking them to help you, even though they have no real reason to. By building social capital simply through having conversations, including them in the decision-making process, and taking the time out just to ask, hey, is there anything I can do for you? You're putting that capital away in the bank that you can use when you really need it. I always think back to deploying an LMS and realising that the data protection team was going to be a huge part of this process. I didn't engage them early enough, and so when the natural request for a DAPRA came through, which is, for those not living in the UK and dealing with GDPR, a massive pile of documentation about, where's the data going, who's it being processed by, how long is it being processed for, etc, etc, etc. I was out in the cold. It was my first time requesting something from them, and it was a big request. With no social capital in the bank, needless to say, it was a hard sell. And following that, I was effectively socially indebted to these people. Now, sometimes you want to be in social debt. Sometimes, whether you want it or not, it's just a reality. But as much as you can avoid it, you should. Your relationships will be better if you're never asking for something for nothing. If you go out of your way to help people, then when you need or request help from them, they are far more likely not only to say yes, but to actually go out of their way to help you rather than just do the bare minimum. The last point here, and this is something I've said many times, is always be easy to work with. This is such an underrated thing in terms of the importance of your workplace relationships. It's all too easy when we're working with SMEs to say how the SME needs to adopt our way of working, and then we give them some ridiculously complicated version of the ADDIE model or the design odyssey or design thinking, or we give them the 16-point plan for the project and we ask them just to follow along. Realistically, these people, especially if they're volunteer SMEs, do not have time to go halfway towards learning how to be an instructional designer. They don't care what your way of working is, they don't care about the project plan. They need to be able to offer you the support that you need and then crack on with their own job. In the same way that when we're offering support or someone asks us for a little bit of help jazzing up those slides, we want to get that done and get back to our job. Being easy to work with not only improves the individual project you're working on right now, but improves your broader relationships within the business. This extends out to everything we do. When someone comes to us with a training request, rather than being combative and asking that horrible question, is this really a training problem? Instead, just say yes. Say yes and then say, I'm going to help you with this. I can help you even more if we complete a little bit of analysis to define exactly what's needed. We sometimes fall into the trap within L&D of thinking that because we know better, and let's just pause to reflect on the fact that we very rarely know better, but let's put that to one side for now. Because in our own mind we know better, we need to tell the world why it's wrong. Well, maybe sometimes, but sometimes we just need to help those around us. And in turn, maybe they'll help us when we really need it. Always be easy to work with. On top of how we work, an important part of being easy to work with is actually making sure that everyone involved in this relationship understands what it is. We need to take the time to define the relationship. Everyone likes to know where they stand and what they're responsible for and who they are working with. This is super simple, but not always done. And often, when people talk about problem SMEs or an SME you really struggle to work with, the issue can be traced back to a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship. Who's responsible for what? Who's involved in what? I break this down into 4 key steps. First of all, the roles. Who is who and who reports into who and in what capacity? This is the simplest discussion of relationships you can possibly have. You're the instructional designer, they're the subject matter expert. You may want to define them as a technical subject matter expert and explain to them what that means. Next up, define responsibilities. Everyone should have a clear, understandable of what their deliverables are and an understanding of what they're responsible for. As a functional SME, you're responsible for conducting user experience research and ensuring that you provide insights into the best modality and launch platforms for this content. As simple as that. Third, input. Who will have input on what aspect of the project? There is not a single SME that should have carte blanche input across every element of the project. That's just not viable. Even you as an instructional designer do not have carte blanche over every element of the project. So, from day one, define exactly who will have input on which part of the project, and clearly set out the expectation that if you are not on the list for having input on an area of a project, then your input is not required. Now, there is a fine line between this and stifling valuable and unexpected input. You do need to make sure there is a pathway for someone outside of that list to go, oh hey, just to ask, have you considered this? But it needs to be exactly that. You cannot have it be direct, formal, guaranteed input into that content. Finally, the 4th point is sign-off. Who will have final sign-off of each aspect of the project? If you're working with a technical SME, then they will need final sign-off on the accuracy of the content. but they should not and cannot have final sign-off on the visual design element of the project. It is not a good use of their time to decide whether or not that's the right shade of blue to use, and similarly, they are probably poorly placed to know whether or not that is really a good shade of blue to use. It can feel really harsh telling people you will have no say in this and you will not be involved in that, but in actual fact, you're guaranteeing that they know what they're expected to do and what they're not expected to do. You're guaranteeing how much time they're expected to put into this project and what they're not expected or needed to do with their limited budget of time. It's all about how you communicate this. It isn't about saying, I don't value you, go away in this particular area. It's about saying, where can you bring the most value? Brilliant. Let's focus all of your time and energy there. This is why you may have multiple SMEs on a project. As we discussed before with our technical, functional and sentinel SMEs, there will be different responsibilities, inputs and sign-off requirements for each of them along the way. So once you're into the project and everything's defined and things are in flight, our job is still not done. The SME is there to support us, but equally, we must be there to support the SME. Here, I like to think of our role as being there to help, adapt, and guide. There are 6 important considerations when we're talking about helping, adapting, and guiding our SMEs, and the first one is vision. Part of our role is to paint the picture of the project completed far in the distance. Now, this, as the title of Vision suggests, is not a fully detailed picture because you never really know what it's going to look like until you get much closer to completion. But that does not prevent us casting the broad strokes. We are, in effect, the Bob Ross of the project here. With our great big size 2 brush and maybe a couple of sponges, we're there to tell them, hey, there's a forest over there and maybe there's a stream running through it. We'll kind of figure that out as we get to this stage. And up here's the sky. The sky's a bit grey, but there's a little bit of blue into it as well. And here there are going to be fields. Not sure what flowers there are in the fields. Again, we'll figure that out as we get closer. We are then responsible for revisiting that vision and saying, hey, look, turns out that's not a stream going through the woods, it's a mud track. But there is actually a stream in the meadow over here that leads off over this way. And in fact, in that meadow, there's a large fence surrounded by some stones. Whilst I'm speaking in metaphor here, you understand what I mean. Vision is important, especially in projects that run over longer periods of time. You can't expect people to keep moving forwards if they don't have some idea of where they're trying to get to. Next up, you are there to create a map. You are there to show each step and how each step moves the project towards success. Now, this often falls onto project managers, but as we all know, we aren't all lucky enough to have a designated project manager on every project, and an instructional designer will often have project management skills, and this is where you need to utilize them. You cannot expect SMEs to be project managers. Now, some professional SMEs are. In fact, it's quite a common skill set amongst them, but as we all know, professional SMEs are not often the people that you get to work with. So, although you're not a project manager, make sure you're at least providing a basic concept of what's required to move things forward, and that, if asked, you can tell someone how their effort, how their energy, how their work is moving the project towards success. Ownership in the L&D space is a really interesting concept. We're delivering the project, but we do not in any way own it. An L&D project is owned by the organisation, and we, as learning and development professionals, are ultimately servants to that wider organisation. We aren't the CEO, we aren't the board, we aren't the head of sales or the head of customer service. We are there to enable all of these other functions. And so it's important that whilst we take ownership of our own work, and perhaps to an extent we share ownership of the overall project moving forwards, we never own it. It's not ours, it's the organisation's. In this, we are far more teammates to SMEs than we are their managers. They don't work for us, we're working together, neither one with total ownership of the finished product. Simplifying the way in which you work with SMEs is vital. You will need to provide many pieces of guidance to SMEs. Make them as simple as possible. Provide checklists and process maps wherever you can. My own approach to this is actually to use a standardized document for technical and functional SME input. In that, there are some set questions around what are your sources and where is this information coming from, what steps have you completed, and there'll also be a process guide on how to take initial thoughts and organise them, key considerations around providing detailed referencing. But then the document can be bespoke to the project. What key information do I need? What process are we talking about? What other processes connect to this but are not directly in scope right now? Are there changes going on in the business that I don't know about, that the project isn't considering, but you as an SME think impact this content? By simplifying documentation and standardizing requests, you can make sure that everyone understands exactly what they're being asked for and speed up the time it takes you to go from their basic input to genuine insight and usable content. As always, communication is key. So use stand-ups, town halls and lunch and learns to keep communications open. It can be really dull and corporate to have lots of repetitive ongoing meetings, but actually having a daily or weekly stand-up can be an absolute game changer so long as they are run well. My weekly stand-ups with the development team usually last between 7 and 10 minutes. It gives everyone a chance to voice what they got up to in the previous week, if there are any blockers, if they want to call out any key successes, or any potential problems in the week ahead, there and then with everyone available so that everyone knows about it. Doesn't mean we turn those into great big long rambling meetings. In fact, it's vital that they never become that. Town halls are slightly different concepts, the idea basically being to get everyone together on an all-hands call, catch up, make sure everyone is roughly aligned. This is a great opportunity to revisit the vision we spoke about earlier. Finally, working lunches and lunch and learns are an opportunity for a slightly more casual catch-up without actually taking time out of the day. It's far less a meeting and maybe more an opportunity to drop in. I tend to make 3 lunches a week available drop-in time. So yes, I'll be having my lunch, but if someone wants to catch up, they know they can just drop into the room at that time and catch up with me about whatever they need to talk about. It's casual, it's simple, and if no one shows up, then I just get to quietly eat my lunch. Finally, it's important that we remember to lead. Now, this sounds a little bit obvious, but it's so often overlooked. As instructional designers, we often need to step outside of our processes, our ways of working, and just focus on basic principles of leadership. We need to make sure that there is solid morale within the team, that people know we're moving forwards, that things are moving towards completion, that they are having a positive impact. Often, there will be no one else in the L&D function that does this. Or if they do, they're going to be looking after you and the other L&D members of the project, not SMEs. It's up to you to show every SME that you work with just how much value they're bringing to the project. So with those 6 steps of helping, adapting and guiding SMEs through the process, it's time to wrap up and review. At the end of every project, you should complete a wrap-up and review phase. It's just as important as the stand-ups and can drive continual improvement between projects. This is so important and so overlooked. First things first, celebrate success. Take some time. Have a cake. Have a pizza party. Shake hands and say well done. Do whatever works for your team. Don't force obnoxious, forced fun activities on people, but ensure that success is never ignored. Because when things go wrong, you can be sure they'll be talked about a lot. And that will happen in every project. So when success is achieved, when you create that vision, when you get to the end, acknowledge it as much as you would have acknowledged having failed to do that. Next up, share feedback. Collect and share truly honest feedback between all parties. Often, SMEs just disappear at the end of a project. They're done with, I'll speak to them when I next have a project. But think back to that social capital concept we discussed earlier. How can you build social capital without sharing feedback at the end of a project? Take the time, tell them how it went. Ask them what their experience was like. Consider opening yourself up for 360 feedback, especially if you were the lead on this project. It's vital that you understand that as the leader, whilst you may not have been directly responsible for every output, the overall project leadership sat with you. So if there are problems, you need to know before this happens again. Consider running a lessons learned workshop. This is really common and in the product world is often called a retrospective and is often done weekly. In this context, you may want to just do it after key milestones or at the end of the project, or some combination of all those approaches. The important thing is that you're getting people together who might otherwise not all sit down and have a conversation. Offering one-to-one feedback is great, but having all those involved in the project there in one conversation so that you can throw ideas backwards and forwards, maybe go over some tough moments and talk things out, is really useful. Take some time yourself and reflect on your performance. Yes, think about the process and project outcomes, but really focus on yourself. Would you have wanted to be an SME on your project if you had the relevant knowledge? Were you happy with your own performance? Were you a leader that you wanted to work with in the future? Or were you perhaps a leader that you wouldn't want to work with again? That can be a really tricky act. Self-reflection is never as easy as people think. If you want some support in that space, I would really recommend the work of Julian Stodd, and especially his work around leadership and quiet leadership. In that work, he discusses the fact that we all have a shadow that we cast. Now, there's no option to not cast a shadow, just like in real life. But what we do need to consider is, when our shadow is cast on people, how does it make them feel? What does it leave behind it? Can people thrive in our shadow, or is it a shadow that leaves them unable to grow, unable to do their best? It's quite a deep form of reflection to think about that, but it's well worth your time. Just to recap, there are 4 real key stages to building and getting the most out of your SME relationships. First of all, really understand who your SME is, what type of SME are they, and what is their motivation to be an SME. Make sure you understand both of those before building this relationship. Next up, clearly define roles, responsibilities, who has input, who has sign off. Do not play it by ear. Do not go with the flow. No matter how good you think your relationship is, no matter how many times you've worked together, do not skip this step. The moment you start skipping it is the moment you start running into problems as the project evolves. Once things are in flight, always challenge yourself. Am I helping? Am I adapting? Am I guiding? Your SMEs, yes, are there to support you. Yes, are there to support the project success, but you are there to support and lead them. Do not just stick to the plan because it's the plan and it's there to be stuck to. If something needs to change to help your SMEs, then it needs to change. You are responsible for making that change happen. Finally, wrap up. Never leave a project without a wrap up. Take the time, make the time. It will improve your performance. the organization's performance, and the respect the organization has for you if you're able to, at the end, especially of a successful project, say, we could do this better and here's how. It's an incredibly empowering exercise to look at your greatest success and say, not good enough. I can do better. We can do better. We can achieve more. That is how you truly get the most of an SME relationship. If you're still here, congratulations. It's been a long time. Well done. You're still awake. I hope you found some things in this video useful, insightful, and perhaps some of them even challenging. I'm sure there were some things in here that you don't agree with, and that is awesome. Let me know what they were in the comments. Tell me how you get the most out of SME relationships, and perhaps if you'll try anything new after listening to this session. If you haven't already, please hit the like button and subscribe here on Instructional Design Tips. You can also find me on LinkedIn and Twitter using the handles on the screen. I'd love to continue the conversation, as I think our relationship with SMEs is so undervalued so much of the time, and there's really very little training on this topic out there. If you'd like to support the channel further, please consider signing up to our Patreon for as little as just £1 a month.